Mr. Gillus is a crucial member of the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition that passed one of the country's most comprehensive clean energy bills, the Illinois Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, that ensures the benefits of clean energy economy and the jobs that it creates are accessible to all communities across the state. He is passionate about equitable clean energy policy and implementation and frequently works with community organizations as well as local, state, and federal agencies to ensure we reach our shared climate and environmental justice goals. Please welcome Delmar Gillus.
Thank you. It is indeed a great honor to be here to speak today. What I was really interested in kind of doing is trying to bring together a lot of the things that were discussed already this morning into kind of a capstone. One of the topics that I'm really passionate about that was mentioned in my intro is around equity and making sure solar is accessible to everyone. And one of the things that hopefully came across when you listened to Mark and Danny and Samira and Kelly is that when we worked on the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, we wove equity and access throughout the bill. If you were to go look at the 950 plus pages that folks mentioned earlier, a lot of that text has equity throughout the bill. There's not like a carve-out section. And that was intentional. There's a significant percentage of Illinois' population that is low and moderate income. There's a significant percentage of Illinois' population that through previous versions of economic legislation did not feel like it ever kind of quote unquote got to the ground. And that was something that was important to us. Danny and Samira mentioned in their presentation the importance of the Listen, Lead, Share sessions where we went around the state and really listened to understand what is it that communities need. And oftentimes when you think about need, when you think about LMI, you're thinking about urban centers. But the reality is that as our economy evolves, as the climate crisis becomes more severe, and we start pivoting to more renewable sources of energy, the challenges are cutting across all communities. There's rural communities where coal plants are closing and have closed. And Samira mentioned the Consumer Bill of Rights. Without a Bill of Rights that says, hey, if your plant closes, there are going to be certain provisions taken care of. Are you being retrained? Are there new job opportunities? Are you first in line for resources? We can create a situation that is untenable. So as we talk about equity within the context of CEJA, it's really important to have a broad view of what that equity looks like because it really is impacting a lot of different communities. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks to about 10 minutes because I know Brad is working really hard to kind of get us back on schedule. So what I would like to do is just try to capstone some of the things that we just talked about. So I'm going to touch on a few just kind of highlights of it, but not dig too deep because I think it's important when we talk about bringing solar to everyone that we connect all the pieces that Danny, Samira, Kelly, and Mark talked about. So when we leave here, we know kind of what do we do next? Because to me, that's the purpose of us getting together today, is to take away things that are tangible that we can do to make sure we are bringing solar to our community. So that's where I'd like to focus my time. So as was mentioned earlier, the previous version of the legislation called the Future Energy Jobs Act was passed in 2016. And it really laid the foundation for a lot of what happened during the CEJA timeframe. So I won't go through FEJA, and to some degree FEJA can get a bad rap, much like anything that's kind of a precursor. But what FIJA really did for us is it really laid out our incentive programs, especially the rec program that Kelly spoke about earlier. But then it also helped lay the foundation for a lot of the workforce and contractor development programs that are being really grown through the work in CEJA. So although there can be differing opinions on FIJA, one of the things I'm most excited about FIJA was it laid a solid foundation for the next phase. One of the programs that was part of FIJA was the Illinois Solar for All program. But when you start to look at some of the things that were done through the Illinois Solar for All, which is basically the AMI project, or the AMI program, there are things like there were $14.1 million worth of incentives spent in the first year. There were only 8 approved vendors that first year. So if you think about the program and where it is now, and think back to when it first started, there were only 8 approved vendors. And then when you look at projects, in year 1, there were 4 community solar projects and 7 nonprofit public sector projects. So basically, we were starting from $14.1 million in incentives, 4 community projects, and 7 nonprofit projects with 8 approved vendors. And that was the foundation for ILSFA. And over the years, it's continued to grow. By year 2, just to give you some context, there were 4 community solar projects, 24 nonprofit, and then there were 10 residential projects. And the incentives for those were $23 million, and the approved vendors went from 8 to 49. So you start to see that the programs are starting to trend. Well, one of the challenges that we had when we started working on CEJA was that we noticed a few trends that we wanted to look at a little harder. One of which was that many of our urban centers or population centers across the state weren't seeing a lot of project activity. So many of the projects initially were in rural areas, which was great and it's very exciting, and that we were seeing solar movement, but we weren't seeing a lot of activity at community solar. If you remember the numbers I shared, it was like 4 projects. And so there was a need to address that. There was also a need to address some of the other challenges, like when you start really digging into the numbers, you notice that there was a lack of equitable access. So companies that were kind of lined up on day 1, ready to take advantage of the incentives, kind of jumped into the pond and they were going fast. Meanwhile, we have a lot of women-owned businesses and diverse businesses that were like, what is this new law? How do we engage in it? What's going on? So part of what we wanted to look at for CEJA was how do we start to address some of these things. I won't go into all the details that kind of Danny and Samira went through with the CEJA program, but what I would say is that we worked really hard to kind of level the playing field, provide equal access, and make sure that CEJA's equity programs worked across the state. There was also seen as kind of a Northern Illinois / Chicago bias, and so we wanted to correct for that. So you notice that when Danny presented on where the workforce hubs are located, they're no longer just in one area of the state. There's 13+1 workforce hubs that are located in key areas of the state to make sure that state needs were met. To address some of the equity challenges, a lot of the things that Kelly talked about, like the equity standards were put in place for projects. And so all of these things were built in. One of the pieces that we haven't talked too much about today was a focus on also providing access to capital. So there are multiple programs now that can provide either grant capital or other types of capital for startup businesses. So we go from FIJA to CEJA, and now we start to get into implementation. And this is where I really get excited, because now we're at the point where the rubber meets the road. So what I want to do for the next kind of 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'll gladly turn the mic back over to Brad, is just talk about some of the frequently asked questions about how around engagement. So one of the questions I get a lot is a question around how do I take advantage of some of the great programs? It's like I've kind of heard people talking about CEJA. I want to get in on it. My job is kind of ho-hum. I hear about all these clean energy jobs. Where and how do I engage in these jobs and opportunities? How do I get training? So some of the resources that I would point people to that are interested in getting into the clean energy space are the resources that Kelly and Samira and Danny mentioned earlier. When you go to the IPA website, the workforce portal is a great place to go if you're looking to identify whether you're in a qualifying community. It's also a great place to get connected with employers and others that are working. When you start looking at getting the training, as was mentioned earlier, Rockford was awarded both a hub as well as what's called an Energy Navigator team, which is responsible for outreach and communicating at the community level. The last time I talked to DCEO, many of the hub locations are at the point where they're getting started. And so you really should start to see over the next few months things like websites, advertising, and additional information. So what I would recommend for folks that are interested in getting tied in is to stay closely connected with Sustain Rockford. They are tracking this. I talk to Brad probably about once or twice a week on various things, and he is staying on top of this stuff. Also, the IPA is a good source of information, as is the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. But what you're going to start to see are additional information that is flowing out about where the training is, when the training is going to take place, etc. Another question that I get quite frequently is around contractors that want to engage. It's like, I'm an HVAC contractor, I think I can do these clean energy projects, but I'm not sure. Or I'm an electrician that knows DC electric, how do I get into the solar space? And there's a couple of great channels to do that. If you're interested in the union path, definitely check out the local IBEWs. IBEW is going to be hosting and coordinating training through their partner organization, Hire 360, and it's going to provide a very comprehensive, high-quality training. If you're interested in community-based training, the hubs are going to be available. I would encourage everybody to do their research and figure out which one fits you best based on your background and what your goals are, because those two training programs will be slightly different. The other thing that you can do, once again, you'll notice I'll keep mentioning DCEO, or the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. If you have your Google machine in front of you, if you type in CEJA and then type in DCEO, it'll pull up all the resources, but if you scroll to the bottom of that page, you can get on the mailing list. And they roll out like almost weekly, there's new information that gets rolled out. The last question I just wanted to kind of touch on briefly is a question around community-based projects. A lot of times community groups have heard about all the money that's out there, but then they'll say, hey, I haven't seen any community projects in my neighborhood. And honestly, convenings like this are a very good opportunity to engage in that discussion. CEJA can work a lot of miracles for a lot of folks. They can provide capital, access to projects, and opportunities for contractors, both diverse contractors, women contractors, and market rate contractors. It can provide training, but the one thing that CEJA doesn't do is it doesn't define like where a project is in a neighborhood or a community. So what usually has to happen is that a community or an organization or a church or a synagogue or a YMCA or what have you need to come together with the community and say, hey, it would be really nice if we had community solar in our neighborhood. Or it'd be really nice if we use this brownfield to do X, Y, and Z. And start working with the local government, with local community leaders, et cetera, to put together a project and then submit that project to the IPA per the processes that Kelly mentioned. There are resources to help with that. If you're in a community and that's kind of where you are now, it's like, hey, we really want to do this, but we don't know where to get started. I would encourage you to go out and look at the resources on the IPA website that talk about the project and actually have some step-by-step instructions on how to engage to become an approved vendor if that's the path, and also understand what the process is to get your project approved. So hopefully what I've done is I've tried to connect some dots between some of the pieces that were talked about a little bit earlier. As was mentioned before, I know there's a lot. There's so much to be done, but as someone that was in the room helping negotiate the bill, we were extremely proud of what we came out of the room with. It's not perfect by any stretch, but the goal of it is to get us from 9% renewables to 50%. And the most important part of that goal is to bring communities along. I'll end with something that I say all the time, which is, if we all breathe the same air, drink the same water, and share our energy resources, we have to find a way to work together to solve this climate crisis. We can't do it alone. Thank you, and have a great conference.